From this day forward, I need you to start thinking of your podcast as a business. Either a business of its own or a subsidiary of a business that you already have, because truthfully, having a podcast is having a business. It takes equipment, skills, capital, labor, production, research, development, marketing, and sales, and everything a business needs to grow and thrive, a podcast also needs. So why wouldn't we call it what it is? I started my first podcast in February of 2021. That podcast didn't launch until 3 months later in May of 2021. And we did not make our first dollar on that show until September of 2023. Quick math for you, that was 2 whole years later. As the host of that show would tell you, and I will sadly agree with him, we weren't making great business decisions during those 2 years. Since that time, I've helped podcasts of my own and podcasters all over the world close over $200,000 in revenue directly resulting from their podcast. This episode is all about how to find your first podcast sponsor and some of the tips, tricks, and mistakes I've made along the way monetizing podcasts. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. All right, so no matter what stage of a business or a podcast that you're in, the most important thing is to know the purpose, the vision, the mission behind what we're doing, right? Why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for? What are our long-term goals and outcomes? What are the short-term steps that will bring us to those long-term goals and outcomes? The first thing that I want you to look at is the size and engagement of your audience. Notice I said size and engagement because there's really no magic number. And I really think that this gets to some people before they even get started. Have you ever caught yourself saying or thinking any of the following things? I'm going to monetize when my audience is bigger. When I have more downloads, I'll try to find sponsors. I haven't had enough episodes to start reaching out to brands yet for sponsorship deals. Or generally anything blaming the numbers of your podcast for the reason you're not trying to get sponsors yet. I was working with a podcast, I'd say about a month ago, that still has not launched. Like at the time that I am recording this podcast, that podcast has still not launched. And it's this person's first podcast. They hired me to put together a deck and some pitches for prospective sponsors and to help me position the current brand they have to sell advertisements on this podcast. Did you hear that? That's the sound of all the excuses for you not reaching out to potential sponsors or brands because your podcast isn't big enough flying right out the window. Because here's the thing, this podcaster is pitching their podcast before their first episode is even live. Now, let me preface that with saying that this person has an established following already with engaged followers, and they're betting on those followers that engagement will follow them to the podcast, and that's a perfectly fine strategy. I think we as podcasters tend to underestimate the power of our full online presence when we're pitching to brands because we're so focused on the downloads and the charts and all the things that mean something to us. But guess what? Brands don't know crap about podcasts. Like, I wish I could scream that from the roof. Brands don't know anything about podcasts. They really don't. They're looking at what they can understand. So if you're coming to the table with, let's say, 25,000 followers on LinkedIn and you're showing them your download numbers, they're probably going to be putting an equal amount of weight onto your highest converting social media. So in this example, the 25,000 followers on LinkedIn, because they actually can see that with their own eyes. And in their marketing experience, they know what that means. Like I said earlier, your podcast is a business and you need to think like a business. If you're a podcaster pitching to a brand to work with them, you need to understand your podcast is here to provide value to another business. That value, in most cases, is going to be exposure and brand awareness from your podcast audience. So here comes the next thing I want you to work on. Knowing your target audience. If you don't know the people who are listening to your podcast, you pretty much have zero value to provide to a potential sponsor. That's why they're working with you. That's why they're giving you money. They want to know their message is falling on ears of listeners who are aligned with their missions and goals. have the resources and accessibility to purchase, and will hopefully convert into paying clients. So I need you to have a rock solid view of what your target audience and listener demographics are to share with potential partners of this show. Who are your listeners? Where do they live? What are their age? What is their gender? Roughly, what's their income and career demographic? Why do they listen to your podcast? And what are the other podcasts that they listen to? So some of this information you'll be able to find on your podcast hosting website. And some of it you'll be able to find on Apple Podcast Connect and Spotify for podcasters. If you haven't set those accounts up, I encourage you to do so immediately. Because really, those will give you the individual demographics that your hosting website probably can't. Some of this information will come from the knowledge that you have of your show and who you're making it for. One of the hardest things about podcasting, in my experience, and pitching a podcast to sponsors is the inconsistent information we have to share. But my best advice to you is to do some internal reporting for yourself. Compare it against the information you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, your own hosting website, and go from there. The last thing before we start talking about pitches is to evaluate how much time, money, and resources it's taking you right now to make this podcast. I'm going to go back another time to your podcast being a business, but you need to have a profit and loss, and you need to know what these partnerships or sponsorships need to look like from a financial perspective that is actually going to make sense for your show. So the first thing we're going to do is something that I would guess a lot of podcasters probably haven't done, but is a critical part of business, and that is adding up all your monthly expenses. I'm just making these numbers up, but to give you a better idea, I've tried to go and look at how much these things actually cost so that together we can kind of figure out, okay, what are we spending on this podcast every month? So let's say you have Adobe Creative Suite. That's $60 a month. Your podcast hosting is $20 a month. You hire a part-time audio engineer at $80 an episode, and you have 4 episodes a month. So that's $320 a month. Your equipment spend out over the year, so that's broken up, is $66 a month. So that's keeping up with buying new microphones and equipment when you need it. And when randomly your headphones die, it's replacing that and doing those different things throughout the year. You pay for ChatGPT Plus, that's $20 a month to help you write blogs and episode descriptions. You have Riverside for virtual interviews, that's $15 a month. And for your transcript and editing, you have Descript, and that's $24 a month. Okay, so let's talk about you personally and the time and effort that you are investing into this with your own sweat equity. Let's say that you're putting in 20 hours every month into outlining, writing, recording, doing pre and post production, and you're going to give yourself a very modest, let's say $20 an hour for the value of your time. That'd be $400 a month. When we add that all together, that's $925 a month, which if we're rounding it up is about $12,000 a year reasonably to run your podcast. So why are we talking about all this? Why are we doing this? Is it to stress you out about how much it costs to run a podcast? No. It's to help you realize that even a small scale podcast operation has reoccurring expenses. You have expenses too. Making a podcast is not free content, even though there are some people that will try to treat it like that. And that's why I'm trying to break this down so that you can really see your podcast, even without any listeners, is worth something because it takes money to make. Which leads me into our next segment of the episode, crafting the pitch. Before we make a pitch, we need to take what we've collected about our audience size and engagement and target audience and monthly expenses and lay it all out in a pricing guide to send to potential partners. This is where some podcasters start to fall apart, but it truly is all in the data that we've already collected, so don't worry. You shouldn't have to guess what a partnership with your podcast should cost. It's all there already. So if you're totally new to this world, I want to walk you through a few of the different options that we're normally selling for podcast advertisements. And the most popular for brands is normally an a la carte option or pick your own of pre-roll, mid-roll, or post-roll, or they buy the whole episode. So let me kind of explain what this is. These ads air respectively. So pre-roll is going to be before your episode starts. So when you first turn it on and you click play and that ad plays, and you usually skip through it, that is your pre-roll ad. Mid-roll is going to be halfway through the episode. Post-roll is at the end of the episode, after the episode finishes. Typically, these ads range anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes with 1 to 2 ads per slot. So for example, you might have 1 2-minute ad in the pre-roll before the episode, 2 1-minute ads in the mid-roll in the middle of your episode, and 2 30-second ads in the post-roll after the episode finishes. When it comes to placement and permanence of ads, you have 2 different options normally. This ad can either be baked in, and that's the terminology that we use for when it's going to be forever part of the recording. Or you can have dynamic ads. Those are temporary ads that sponsors pay for a given time slot. So let's say they buy all your pre-roll for the next month. Every single podcast for the next month will start with that sponsor's ads, no matter the episode. But after that month, that ad goes away. So to recap, baked in is part of your total podcast mix and will never leave that specific episode. It is permanent. And dynamic podcast ads are temporary and only last a certain amount of time and usually span all episodes. All right, so the last thing is pricing. What should your podcast pricing be? I can tell you what Google will say, but what does Google know? I can tell you one thing, Google doesn't know anything about you or your podcast or what you bring to the table. And to be fair, neither do I. But you know who does? You. You have to be your own advocate and you have to be the one doing the math, both literally and figuratively, to figure out what is best for your podcast. Just like in business, the only person who is going to be putting you first is yourself. And if you give someone else the keys to drive, they will. All right, so I'm going off my example from earlier of a podcast that costs roughly $1,000 per month to operationalize. Let's say you want to have a profit of $500 per month in addition to that $1,000 of operating expense. That's a total of $1,500. If you have 4 episodes per month or 1 every week, that breaks down to $375 per episode you'd need to make from ads with sponsors. To give you some context here, pre-roll or the ads that come before the episode are normally the second most expensive. Mid-roll ads, the ones that play in the middle of the episode, are going to be the most expensive and typically the longest. And post-roll ads, the ones that play at the end of the episode, will be the shortest and the least expensive. So with all that in mind, if we're looking to make $375 an episode, I might price it at $130 for the pre-roll, $165 for the mid-roll, and $80 for the post-roll. This is, of course, completely dependent on your audience behaviors, how your episodes are laid out, and the value you're bringing to the sponsor. For example, I have a podcast that I produce that always has a special question at the end of the episode, which makes our post-roll ads worth more than another podcast that just ends the episode in a casual way. So keep in mind your own podcast and also what your sponsor is looking for from this ad. So once you have a good idea of your ad structure, along with everything that we've talked about before, it's time to start putting together your pitch deck and your PDF to send out to sponsors. This can be as simple or as elaborate as you want it to be, truly. My best advice is to provide the information in a way that will quickly show potential sponsors the core values of your podcast in an easily digestible way. You need to include who they'd be aligning with through your audience, your digital reach, your podcast monthly downloads, and your average individual episode download rate. Why you think they should partner with you, and of course your pricing. You can quickly put together a pricing guide in Canva or lay it out in a Word document. Like I said, this can be as involved as you want it to be, but remember, showing the potential sponsor what value they will be getting as a partner of yours is the ultimate objective. All right, so it's the time we've all been waiting for. It's time to start pitching your podcast. Podcasting is a relatively new medium for advertising, but it gives something most other social medias can't. And I believe that's a true personal connection. That is really the magic of podcast partnerships. When you're partnering with a podcast, you're speaking through the host. A host that a lot of the time this listener has spent dozens, possibly hundreds or thousands of hours listening to. That being said, it's critical for you to look for brands and companies that are aligned with your podcast. They're aligned with your listeners. They're aligned with you as a host. Start by reaching out to the products that you already use and love, and that maybe you've already talked about on your podcast for free. Don't be afraid of getting ghosted. I know this is scary. You are going to get ghosted. You are going to hear no. It's just going to happen. And it's not personal. Again, this is just business. In the beginning, I'd suggest for you to reach out to 10 brands/companies per week. Ideally, you're going to do this via email to send your pricing PDF and all that information, but sometimes you have to reach out to people via DM. And that's okay, but in my opinion, try to get out of their direct messages as quickly as possible. If you're DMing with a brand, I'd say, hey, is there someone in your partnerships team that I can talk to? Is there someone in your marketing team I can talk to? Like I said, sometimes you can't find these email addresses just by Googling. Sometimes you can. It just all depends on how often they usually do partnerships, if they're open to people pitching them or not. You might have to put in a little bit of extra work for this, but just remember, this is really all just a numbers game, and it is going to take some time and patience on your end. Very, very few podcasters are ever just offered sponsorships out of the blue. Normally, people aren't just knocking down your door to give you advertising dollars. Make sure that you're keeping track of who you're reaching out to. I just make a quick Excel spreadsheet or something in Google Drive with the name of the company, who you reached out to, the day that you reached out to them, and the day that you followed up. Also, you need to be following up at least one time. That way you can keep things organized and make sure that you're hitting that goal of reaching out to 10 people per week. Just remember, your podcast is a business, and businesses take time to grow and make money. It takes most businesses 18 to 24 months to break even. So give yourself some grace, keep trying, keep going, and as always, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.